The following lecture is from my Udemy course, Complete 3D Animation Masterclass, Create Animated Shorts. If you like my teaching style and are interested in taking your skills from intermediate or beginner to advanced 3D artist, consider enrolling in my course. Link in the bio. All right, in this next section, we're going to go ahead and take a look at animation. Now, normally, if we're in a linear pipeline setup, we'd actually do rigging before animation. But since this is our first time animating potentially, we want to explore the challenges we're going to face in animation so we know what we need to do to the rig to make animation easier. So before you can rig, you kind of need to understand animation and the problems you're trying to solve. So to get started, let's go ahead and use our ball here, but let's start a fresh file. That way we don't accidentally mess up our ball scene here. We're going to come up here to File, Save Scene As, and in our Scenes folders here, you can hit this up arrow, by the way, to navigate these folders if you weren't aware. We can go to Scenes, we can right-click and create a new folder, and we'll just name this Animations. And I'll go ahead and just name this our Practice Animation, or Intro Animation, whatever you want to name it, and just make that my ASCII and do a Save Scene As. Now, we also don't really need the light, so you can go ahead and get rid of that. If you do, just remember to turn the lights back on by clicking the light bulb here, and that way we will be back and able to see our object, not as a giant shadow. Now, coming in here and talking about animation, we're going to need to adjust some of our views to make sure we're having the correct menus open. The first menu you want to make sure you have is your channel box here. Remember, you can access that here using the channel box icon, or along the side, you can click channel box. And the next thing is the time slider here. That's going to be the main area we're working in with animation. Let's go ahead and talk about the time slider down here. What this is going to be our time slider or timeline. Both names can work. And this is going to be where time is located at in Maya. Now, understanding time inside of 3D is going to be recorded in what we call frames. And you may have heard the terms frame per second. That is regarding this same concept, the amount of frames you have in 1 second of animation. So essentially, this is a giant measuring stick of frames, and that's what it measures it in. And just like if we were talking about things like centimeters to meters or inches to feet, you have number of frames 2 seconds, okay? So the default of frames inside of here is going to be 24 frames per second. And when we're thinking of the timeline here, essentially every 24 frames is 1 second of animation. It's a measuring tool. That's what we're looking at. So that would be 1 second. And if I drag this out to 48, that'd be 2 seconds, so on and so forth. You can change the frame rate you operate at, but we're going to stick to the default 24 frames per second to begin with. Now, from a traditional standpoint, frame regards a drawing. So if we're thinking of something like a traditional two-dimensional animation, a frame would be a single piece of paper with a drawing on it, and another frame would be another piece of paper with another drawing on it, and this would repeat and be put into a projector, and then when played back would form the basis of a movie. So that's the idea behind the tools we're working with here. If you recall, when we were looking at the movement positions, we explored their relation to the channel box here. And when we use the move tools, what happens is in the channel box, positions are recorded. And this is what we're going to be tracking in animation, is essentially an object's movement through space mathematically. So this object started at 0, 0, right here, but to get here, it had to make these movements, and that's going to be what the computer records. However, we need to tell it to record it. So how do we do that? We're going to do that through something called a keyframe. A keyframe stores the position of an object at a point in time, okay? So we're going to use keyframes to do this. The other thing we need to do is we need to understand how to move time, because since these are going to store them at a point in time, it's important we know how we can switch time. To switch time, it's as simple as clicking down here and dragging this gray box to a new point in time. The gray box indicates where you're at in time. I'm currently at 0, but let's say I wanted to get to 24, I could drag it over here to 24. So I would click on this here and drag it to 24, and now I'm on the 24th frame. If we had keyframes along here, during this transition, we would actually see the ball moving, but we currently don't. So let's make that happen. Let's return the ball to 0, 0 by just zeroing out our translates, rotates, and scales. Zero that out. And we now have this in place. I'm going to make sure my time is set to 0, so we start right at the beginning, and I'm going to make it animate forward 1 second in that direction. To do this, we're going to need to switch from our modeling shelf up here to our animation shelf. So we'll go ahead and switch to animation, and we can access the keys through the key menu. In order to set a keyframe, you need to have the object selected in object mode, and you need to come up here to key and select one of the keying options. I'm going to select key and set key, the very first option here, and this is going to set a keyframe. What you'll see here now is that our channel box has gone red, and our timeline has a red notch on it. Red in the channel box equals a keyframe, and red on a timeline is also a keyframe. So that's how we can indicate an object has been keyframed. We'll see red on the timeline when we click on it, and we'll see red in the channel box when we click on it. However, you might also see pink in the channel box. So let's talk about why. If we go ahead and move our time here forward to 24 frames by clicking and dragging it, you'll see that this is no longer red, but it's either light red or what we might refer to as pink. What that means is that this object has animation somewhere in time, but it doesn't have a keyframe on this specific frame. Now, let's make it have a keyframe on this frame. What we can do is we can move our object forward in the direction we want it to go. We can then come back up here to key, and we can select set key, and we can set another keyframe. So now what's happening is this character is moving from 0 to this location in 1 second, or what we would refer to as 24 frames. Now, you can see this occurring by doing something called scrubbing. Scrubbing a timeline is where instead of playing it, you drag back and forth. And this lets you view it at your leisure. So let's go ahead and scrub that just to confirm it worked. And you can see now that is indeed moving as I adjust time. And we can play it by coming over here and using the playback controls. Now, these are fairly common to animating software, so you may already be familiar with these if you've worked with other animation software. The two main ones are here, which is going to be play forward and play backwards. Those will play our animation when clicked on. Next to this is going to be jump to previous frame and jump to next frame. We can click those to jump between keyframes on an object, which can be useful for refinement. For example, if I click forward here, you'll see I jump to frame 24. If I click backwards, I go to frame 0, and that's because it's jumping to the next keyframe that's set on time. The ones next to that are going to be jump forward and jump backward 1 frame. So if you just need to move in 1 frame increments, you can click this for a high level of precision. And this can be very useful when you're refining your animation or when you're doing very fast-paced animations that require precise timing. The final ones are going to be jump to the start of time and jump to the end of time. So those will jump to the very first frame that you have in your time range, which in this case is 0, and to your very last frame. These are useful for restarting your animation. Now, let's play our animation by clicking this button and seeing what we made. And you might notice that looks a little bit fast, or a lot of it fast. So you're probably thinking, wait a minute, didn't you tell me that 24 frames is 1 second? And I did. The problem is, by default, Maya plays at a playback rate called free. Now, what that means is it plays back as fast as it possibly can. This, once again, has to do with data management. And the reason why is certain things like fully animated and textured characters, or cloth simulations, or dynamic particle effects, or fluids, they require a lot of processing power. And sometimes it will crash your computer if you say you have to take this object and you have to go this fast with it. So we have something very simple like a ball, so it doesn't quite make sense to us because it's teleporting across the screen. But if we had something super complex, it would, because it might still be going a bit slow with FreeSet. Now, how do we change that to have a more accurate playback? We can do so by coming to the little running man in the corner here, and this is going to be where the animation settings are located. So if you go ahead and click on that little running man, it's going to pull up your animation settings. And in our animation settings here, we can adjust the playback speed. Now there's a lot going on in here. You can see you can adjust your frame rate. I do not suggest doing that at this stage. Let's stick to 24 frames per second to begin with. But down here is where we can change our playback. You'll notice the playback speed is currently set to play every frame, and the playback speed maximum here is set to free. There's two approaches we can take to this. We can take the maximum playback speed and we can change it here, or we can change the playback every frame and change it here. There are subtle differences in terms of how tools will work. There's not really a right way or a wrong way, so we'll approach that as an as-need basis. But if you click the drop down here, you'll see you have the option of 24 frames per second times 1. So what this is going to do is it's going to prioritize making the animations play and the amount of time that you've set it to. In other words, in real time. 24 frames per second times 0.5 will mean it goes half as fast, and times 2 twice as fast. These are primarily for previewing here. This one here is for timing. Now, we might want to leave it on play every frame though, because one of the catches to these ones here is they're not going to play every frame, which means we won't see every frame of the animation if we're trying to make adjustments. So how do we get the real-time playback and still see every frame? Under the maximum playback speed, you can switch this to 24 frames per second times 1, 0.5, or times 2. And what that will do is it will guarantee that you see every frame, but you see it in real time. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that for now. We're going to set that free to 24 frames per second times 1 and click save. Now, if we go ahead and hit the play button down here, we'll see a world of difference here in terms of our animation. So I'm going to hit play, and you'll see it's going much slower. And there we go. We now have our ball moving, and it's moving at the correct speed. Okay. Now, one of the things you might want to know how to do is how to delete a keyframe. For example, let's say we wanted to actually turn this into a ball that's bouncing in place. How would I go about doing that, clearing out the animation? If you come down here to the timeline, you can go to the frame that you want to delete with your frame slider here, and you can right-click to perform a range of actions on that frame. The one that we're interested in here in particular is going to be to delete. But notice you can also cut, copy, and paste keyframes, which we might experiment with here in a moment. But let's go ahead and select delete. Now, if we wanted this ball to appear to be bouncing up and down, what we would do is we'd keep our keyframe at 0, but we could move it up a certain amount of frames and down a certain amount of frames to make it look like it's bouncing. So let's go ahead and make it bounce over the course of half a second. I'm going to come to frame 12, which is half of 24, so that's half a second. And I can move this up in Y. Once I have that moved up in Y, I can come up here to the key menu and I can select set key, or I can use the hotkey. Now you can find the hotkey for the various key options next to it, and you'll see that the hotkey for set key is S. So if you want to save yourself from having to come up to this menu a bunch of times, you can use S to set a keyframe. I'm going to click set key to set that keyframe, and you'll see between 0 and 12, the object moves up and down. I can then come to frame 24, and to save myself some time and to make it return back to the same spot, I can go ahead and set this to 0. So that way this is coming to 0 here. And I can hit S on my keyboard to set key. So if I go ahead and just hit S, you'll see that we have now keyframed our ball, and we have a ball moving up and down, just like that. Now, what if we wanted to bounce longer? Well, we could use copy and paste to achieve that. If I hold Shift and go from 12 to 24 here, we can select this range here. Make sure you're set to 24. You can then right-click and copy to copy these. And if I move to another point in time, we can paste. So I'm doing this every 12 frames. So 12 plus 24 would be 36. I can go to frame 36, right-click, paste, and I can select paste here to paste in those keyframes. And now that will be pasted up and down, and you'll see we're moving up and down once more. I can continue this out. I could go from 48 to 60, and I could paste again. And you can see now we're making this bounce as much as we want to. However, it would be easier if we create something called a cycle or a loop. That is an animation that just repeats continuously. And we can actually do that by just adjusting time. So I'm going to come back to 24. I could delete multiple the same way I copy and pasted multiple by holding Shift, highlighting in red, right-clicking, and selecting Delete. And that will clear those out. Now, to make this do something called cycle or loop, which means to repeat, I can use the range slider. The range slider is the range of time we see when we hit play. You might have noticed when we hit the end point of play, it comes back to the beginning. So by setting our range slider to just be between the first frame and the last frame, we can repeat it infinitely to get a look at what our jump looks like without having to copy and paste it a bunch. Now, you might be thinking, well, what if we actually wanted to make it longer? There's tools we can use later on to make it repeat itself manually, so we don't need to copy and paste like I showed you necessarily. Now, the range slider is this little doohickey down here. This is actually the physical slider for it. You can grab these knobs and move them either direction to change where your time begins or ends. So I can grab the back end here to change the end point. I could grab the front end to change the beginning. And you can actually grab the bar to move in between. And this can be very useful when you have a large amount of frames in a complex animation. If you're doing very precise work like cycles, you can select your start frame and your end frame, and you can input what you want to work with. So I'll go ahead and set the end frame to 24, and now you'll see my timeline has crunched down to 0 to 24. You might be wondering what the second box is. This is kind of your maximum number of frames. It can always be changed. It's not set in stone, so that is also adjustable, but it can't be lower than what's in front of it. So for example, we couldn't make this one 23 because if our maximum number of frames is only 23, we can't look at 24 of them. Likewise, over here, this can't be higher than your start frame. So if this was 10, it wouldn't let us go to 10. Okay, so you can think of those as your max range, mid-range, everything else is in between. But if I go and hit play now, you'll see this is going to do something called cycle. We're going to be able to see this go up and down infinitely. Pretty cool. But this doesn't quite look like a ball yet. There's a lot of different things that we need to add. So let's go ahead and introduce a bit of a challenge here. What I want you to do is I want you to make a floor somehow. So I want you to think of what kind of polygon primitives you might be able to use to make a floor. And then what I want you to do with the ball, make it squash against the floor when it's down. And I want you to make it stretch when it's up. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint with squash and stretch. This is going to be most easily achieved using the scale tool. And I want you to try that out. So try it on your own, see if you can make it happen, and then come back. And if you couldn't figure it out, we'll go ahead and do it together. All right, so let's go ahead and get started by coming up here to the Create menu, and we can create a polygon plane to represent the ground. So I'm going to go to Create, Polygon Primitives Plane, and I'm just going to scale this up to represent the ground. Now you might see we already have a little bit of an issue. This ball isn't where the ground starts, and that's going to be our first issue here. Take note of that because these are going to be things we might want to correct with our rig. So I need to switch this frame so the ball is above ground. I'll have to move my camera here to be fairly precise and move it upwards. If you would like to be very precise, you can actually set your views to the split view orthographic, and you could utilize the front view to actually see where this should go. We haven't worked with this view yet. It works just like the split view that we used for the first scene. But the way it works is to edit in any of these views, you can click into them. And if you want to get a closer look, you can actually tap spacebar. So just tap it, and you can make that full screen. As a matter of fact, the hotkey to switch into split view is just tapping spacebar. So you can tap that, and you can see I can come back into my main screen by just clicking in here and tapping space again. So you don't hold it, you just tap it, and that's going to let you move back and forth between these. Okay. Now we can zoom in here just to make sure this is on the ground. So we'll go ahead and place that there. and make sure it's as perfect as possible. You might notice over here, translate Y's at 1. 1 unit above the ground is going to get it to stay. Now, when you want to override a keyframe, you'll notice if I hit play, it jumps right back into place. To override a keyframe, you need to hit S again. All right, so if you go ahead and hit S again, it's going to override this keyframe. However, let's say we wanted it to do that automatic. We can turn on something called auto key. And auto key is on by default in a lot of animation softwares, but it's not on by default in Maya. And that's because sometimes it gets us in trouble. Now, auto key is going to be located down here, right next to the render settings. It's going to be that icon there with the arcing arrows, bottom and top, and a little line in between. So right there, if you go ahead and click that on, it's going to have a box around it, and that box indicates it's in recording mode. Now, if I come to something like frame 24 and I move this up and I move time, you'll see it will stay at frame 24 because what it does is as long as you have a keyframe set, it's going to change the value in that channel to represent whatever change you've made. But that channel needs to have a prior keyframe. So if I were to create a fresh object in here, or I were to grab something like my ground plane and just start moving this thing around, you'll see that auto keyframe doesn't do anything to that because it has no keyframe set. Okay, so it needs to have a keyframe set already. And we can just move that back up to 1. And we can hit play, and now that will be moving against the ground there. But we have a little bit of an issue because it's not really looking like it's bouncing against the ground. And that's where this idea of squash and stretch is going to potentially come in. We can come in here and we can try and get this to squash by using the scale tool. You can animate pretty much anything in here, including scale. And if I go ahead and scale this down, you'll see this sort of concept of squashing. However, squashing is a little bit more complicated than this because when something squashes, it doesn't just shrink down in one axis, it also spreads out evenly in the other axes. So it's going to need to come an even portion this way and an even portion this way. As a generic rule, we can just utilize our channels over here to enter this, and we can think of displacement. So if this comes down, for example, 0.5, height-wise, this way, then it's probably going to displace that additional information in the opposite axes. So each of these would come out something like 0.25 to make the volume equal. So instead of being at 1.27, it might be at 1.25 and 1.25. And that's going to give us a squash. But the problem is this isn't on the ground anymore either. Quite the challenge. We might be able to find some help here with the split view so we can see where the ground is a little bit better. But you're going to see what we're doing now is something called counter animating. What that means is we are having to go backwards to go forward. And this is very tedious, and it's the reason why I wanted you to do this before we talk about rigging, because this is the type of thing that rigging helps us solve. So now if I go ahead and hit play, you'll see the ball kind of lifts off here, but we don't want the ball to just lift off. We want it to stretch off, to feel like it's anthropomorphic, like it's jumping. So what I might do is give this about 4 frames of stretch and switch these values. So instead of y being at 0.5, I'll set it to 1.5. And instead of scaling x being at 1.25, I'll set this to 0.75. So we're subtracting that 2.5 away from each of these to add up to 50. And from there, I have to move this down to keep it on the ground, but you'll see now we start to get this idea of squash and stretch. However, notice what happens is it sticks in the ground. Now, that probably doesn't look that bad from here, so we can probably get away with that, and that's looking pretty springy, which is quite nice. However, to be accurate, we'd have to come in here and do something called counter animate. So that would mean I'd have to come in frame by frame and move this to make sure it's not touching the ground or going through the ground rather. All right, so you can see every frame there, I have to nudge it a little bit, but now I get that perfect little bounce. It would be really nice if we didn't have to do that. So that's the type of stuff we're going to want to solve in our rig. You can see that bounce adds a nice little bit of spring to the front, But if we want to make this truly bounce, we have to add this to the end. So let's go ahead and copy these over now. First thing I'm going to do is copy my squash. I'm going to come to my first frame and copy, and I can right click and paste, and that will paste that. And I'm going to come to my stretch as well, and I'll just subtract 4 from this, go to frame 20, and right click and paste there. So that way it's doing the squash and stretch at the end. And now we should get a better sense of spring to this, where it's kind of going up and down and looking a bit more like a bouncing ball that has a bit of appeal to it. There still is a lot more we could do to make it look better. And also on the tail end, to prevent it from looking like it's penetrating the ground, we'd also have to come in here frame by frame and keyframe this so that it's sitting on the surface. Interestingly enough, I only had to do 1 frame towards the end there, but it also looks like it's penetrating the ground before it hits. So there's all sorts of headaches that are being caused by this animation here that hopefully we'll be able to fix in reading. You can see auto keyframe made that a lot easier to deal with. However, there are some consequences to auto frame I do want to show you. So one of the consequences to auto keyframe is it only keys the channel you moved. So notice that translate Y is the only thing that has an actual keyframe here. That means at this particular frame, that is the only actual thing being recorded, meaning that if we were to change any other aspect of this, it would transition between those points still. So just kind of be aware of that. To give an example, let's say between frame 4 and 12, I wanted this to do a flip. I wanted it to rotate in the air. I could come to something like frame 8 here, and I could spin this in X 360 degrees. I'm going to type that in to make my life easier. And what you will see is this thing's not going to rotate anywhere else in this animation except for there, but not quite. It's actually rotating beforehand. Now, why is that? Well, we didn't have a solid keyframe on this stretch frame. We only made this stretch frame with auto key, and we keyed our translate Y and we keyed our scales, but we didn't key our rotate. So rather than this rotating just between 4, 8, and 12, like I had planned, it's actually going between 0 and 12. And that's because the only solid keyframes, solid meaning everything has a keyframe on it, that we have are at 0, 12, and 24. Now, this can work to our advantage, though, because what if I wanted it to be flipping the whole time? Well, then this did exactly what I wanted it to. But that's not what I wanted. I wanted at frame 4 for this to be ready for takeoff, which it is, ironically, because that just happened to land at 180. But I didn't want it to be flipping all the way here from 1 to 4, okay? Now, if I go ahead and set my rotate Z to 0 here, auto keyframe is going to kick that in. And if I go back to in front of this, you'll see these all go to 0. And that's because they didn't have a keyframe on them, and they still don't. So they're going to the next keyframe in line, which is here. And that's because keyframes transition between keyframes. So originally, before I set the rotate to 0 here, it was transitioning between 0 and 8 rotations. But after setting this to 0, it's now only going between 4 and 8 rotations. So now we'll see that rotate a full 360 degrees before it even hits the upward position. Now that's all a bit silly. I just wanted to show you the consequences of auto key with that. And with this particular exercise, I wanted you to see the pain points that we're going to encounter as an animator. This method here is often referred to as brute force animation. Now, brute force animation is a term that essentially means make it happen no matter the circumstances. So can you make a bouncing ball without a rig? Yes, you can make a lot of animations without a rig. And I want you to understand that, especially for those of you who maybe are doing this as a hobby and you find rigging overwhelming. Don't let that stop you, because if you can make it work this way, do you, okay? You don't have to worry about what the industry is doing. But this idea of brute force animation is when you maybe don't have the right tool, or maybe you don't have the right setup, you just force it to work. And a lot of the times what that means is you come in each and every frame and make it look like it's at the correct position. All right. So rigging is going to help alleviate this. It's going to give us the ability to have things set up already so we don't have to worry as much about, well, really any of this, okay? It's going to make our lives easy. That's the purpose of rigs, is to make the animator's life easy. But before we take a look at that, what I want you to do is I want you to try it the hard way. I want you to try and do some brute force animation to make the ball bounce. So if you didn't manage to do it on your own, go ahead and pause, and before moving to the next section, try it out. If you have a hard time with it or it looks awful, just go with it. And hopefully it will give you an understanding of the problems we're trying to solve with rigging. Okay, so that is our first look at animation. This video kind of goes over all the basics. If you need to come back and review it, feel free to. We'll be adding to this as we go. There's obviously still many things we need to cover, but hopefully this gives you a good start point.